Somewhere in northern China, in the early hours of a spring morning in 1644, a general made a decision. We don't know exactly what was in his mind. We don't know whether he hesitated, whether he paced, whether he slept at all that night. What we do know is that when dawn came, he opened a gate. And what came through that gate swept away 276 years of one of the longest-running dynasties in Chinese history. That's the thing about hinge moments. They rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive wrapped in the grandeur you'd expect from something that reshapes centuries. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the dark, at a gate in a wall. The year 1644 is one of those years that historians return to again and again, not because it was simple, but because it was spectacularly complicated. It was a year when loyalties collapsed faster than anyone could track them, when the people who were supposed to be enemies ended up marching together, and the people who were supposed to be allies turned on each other, when revenge and grief and wounded pride threaded through the largest geopolitical decisions imaginable, when one man's personal humiliation may have altered the fate of hundreds of millions of people across the generations that followed. The general's name was Wu Sangui. In 1644, he was somewhere in his early 30s, commanding the most battle-tested army in the Ming Empire, stationed at a fortress on the northeastern frontier where China met the world beyond its walls. His name would become, depending on who was telling the story, either a byword for treachery or a tragic illustration of impossible choices. Either way, no one disputes that what he did mattered enormously. To understand why, you have to hold several things in mind at once. The Ming Dynasty, already old and straining under its own weight, Beijing, the imperial capital, suddenly without an emperor, a rebel army occupying the city, and beyond the frontier, patient and formidable, a rising power that had been waiting for exactly this kind of crack to appear. The pieces were all in motion. Wu Sangui was standing at the point where they converged. What makes 1644 so endlessly fascinating is that nothing about it was inevitable. Historians have spent centuries asking the what-ifs. What if the Ming had governed better? What if the rebels had been wiser in victory? What if Wu Sangui had made a different choice on that particular morning? History rarely gives us moments where a single decision is so traceable, so consequential, so human in its origins, and so vast in its aftermath. We're going to follow all of it slowly tonight. The dynasty's long unravelling, the forces that rose to fill the vacuum, and the man in the middle holding an army and a gate and a grief that by some accounts changed everything. If you're settling in to listen, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is there. Someone already asleep, someone just lying down, someone across an ocean in the middle of a quiet afternoon. Let me know in the comments. Now let's go back to the beginning of the end. The Ming Dynasty, by the time it reached the 17th century, had been running for nearly 300 years. That's worth pausing on. 3 centuries of continuous imperial rule, of examinations and bureaucracies and tribute missions and philosophical traditions layered one on top of another. At its height, Ming China was arguably the most sophisticated civilization on Earth, by almost any measure you'd care to use. Its cities were enormous. Its silk and porcelain moved along trade routes that stretched across oceans. Its educated classes could recite classical texts that Europeans wouldn't encounter for another generation. There was real wealth here, real grandeur, and yet beneath all of that, something had been quietly going wrong for a very long time. Empires don't collapse suddenly, they fray. And the Ming had been fraying in ways that were easy to miss if you were looking at the surface. One of the deepest problems was money, or more precisely, the strange way the Ming economy had become dependent on silver. By the late 1500s, China had woven itself into global trade networks in ways that made it almost structurally dependent on silver flowing in from Spanish America and Japanese mines. The imperial tax system had shifted towards silver payments, which worked reasonably well as long as that silver kept flowing. When global silver supplies contracted in the early 1600s, partly due to disruptions in trade, the effects rippled inward fast. Taxes became harder to collect, the treasury strained, and military costs, which were never modest on an empire of this scale, became genuinely crushing. Those military costs were not abstract. The Ming were fighting on multiple fronts across decades, suppressing internal unrest, managing the always contested northern frontier, dealing with a rising power beyond the northeastern passes that we'll come to shortly. Each campaign required soldiers, and soldiers required payment, and payment required silver that was becoming harder and harder to find. This shortfall was partially met by raising taxes further, which was perhaps the worst possible response to a countryside that was already suffering, because the countryside was in serious trouble. The early 17th century brought a cluster of climate disruptions that historians sometimes group under the term the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped, rainfall patterns shifted, drought struck regions that had been reliable farmland for generations. The 1630s were particularly brutal. Harvests failed across the North China Plain in ways that hadn't been seen in living memory or beyond living memory. Famine followed, the grinding generational kind that doesn't just kill the hungry, but hollows out communities. People sold children, abandoned villages, wandered in search of food that wasn't there. The smell of desperation spread across the interior, and with it, the conditions for something worse. Meanwhile, at the top of the system, the court was increasingly dysfunctional, in ways that made it poorly equipped to handle any of this. The late Ming emperors ranged from the distracted to the practically absent. One emperor famously retreated from governance so completely that officials went years without an imperial audience. Into the vacuum rushed eunuchs, factions, and bitter internal rivalries that consumed the energy that should have gone toward actual governance. The Donglin movement, a loose coalition of scholar officials trying to push for moral reform, fought vicious battles with their opponents at court. The results were denunciations, purges, imprisonment. Men who might have been effective administrators were instead caught up in fights about who was closest to the emperor's ear. Corruption deepened at every level. Tax revenues that should have reached the centre were being skimmed along the way. Military units that existed on paper had commanders drawing pay for soldiers who weren't there. Frontier garrisons that were supposed to be staffed and supplied were sometimes neither. What all of this meant in practice was that the Ming faced a compounding problem. Threats that were growing larger on the outside and inside simultaneously, with a government that was increasingly unable to respond to either. A state apparatus built for stability was now being asked to manage simultaneous crises, and it lacked the flexibility, the resources, and frankly the leadership to do it. The wood had been drying for decades. By the 1640s, someone only needed to strike a match. The match, when it came, would be struck partly from within and partly from beyond the northeastern passes. But the force waiting beyond those passes had not appeared overnight. It had been building for decades, quietly and deliberately, in a way that the Ming court consistently underestimated until it was far too late. To understand what the Manchus were, you have to first set aside the idea that they were simply another raiding people pressing at the frontier. That's how the Ming tended to think about them, at least initially, and that misreading would prove catastrophic. The Jurchen people, as they were known before they renamed themselves Manchu, had deep roots in the forests and river valleys, northeast of China proper, in the region we now call Manchuria. They were not strangers to Chinese civilization. Jurchen groups had interacted with, traded with, and sometimes fought against Chinese states for centuries. An earlier Jurchen dynasty, the Jin, had actually ruled northern China in the 12th and 13th centuries before being swept away by the Mongols. That history mattered. It meant there was already a tradition of Jurchen statecraft, a memory that this people had once done something extraordinary, and a set of institutions and ideas to draw on. The man who transformed scattered Jurchen clans into something new was Noherzi, and he is worth thinking about carefully. He began with very little, a minor chieftain from one of many competing Jurchen groups, nursing grievances that were personal as much as political. His father and grandfather had been killed in what he believed was a Ming-sanctioned attack, and that wound seems to have never entirely healed. But Noherzi was not simply driven by revenge. He was a builder, Over decades of warfare, alliance, and careful diplomacy, he unified the Jurchen clans under his leadership in a process that combined genuine military brilliance with something rarer, institutional imagination. The 8 banners system he created is the key to understanding everything that followed. On the surface, it sounds straightforward enough. Warriors were organized into units identified by colored banners, yellow, white, red, blue, and then bordered versions of each. But the banners were never just a military structure. They were a total social organization. Every Jurchen man, woman, and child was registered under a banner. The banner was your community, your identity, your administrative unit, and your military obligation all at once. It created cohesion across clan lines that had previously been sources of endless fragmentation and conflict. When you fought alongside your banner. When you received a land or grain or rewards, they came through your banner. The system gave Nurhaci's emerging state a kind of internal discipline that most steppe or frontier powers never achieved. He also did something politically sophisticated. As he absorbed Mongol groups into his coalition, he created Mongol banners for them, using the same structure to integrate people who were not Jurchen at all. Later, as Chinese defectors and captives joined in larger numbers, there would eventually be Chinese banners too. The banner system was not just a way of organizing fighters, it was a way of absorbing different peoples into a single political community without forcing them to entirely abandon their identities, or at least that was the theory and practice. It was more complicated. Nurhaci declared himself the Khan of a new state in 1616, naming it later Jin, in a deliberate echo of that earlier Jurchen dynasty that had ruled northern China. He then formally announced 7 grievances against the Ming and began open war. The campaigns that followed showed just how formidable this new force had become. Ming armies, often poorly paid, poorly supplied, and led by commanders who had risen through court politics rather than battlefield experience, found themselves badly outmatched. The Battle of Sahu in 1619 was a turning point. A large Ming expeditionary force sent to crush Nurhaci before he grew stronger was divided, outmaneuvered, and destroyed in a way that reverberated through the dynasty's military confidence for a generation. Nurhaci died in 1626, following a campaign where he was actually repulsed by a Ming cannon defense, one of the few genuine setbacks of his later career. His son Hong Taiji took over, and in some ways the story becomes even more interesting here. Hong Taiji was less purely a warrior and more explicitly a state builder. He reorganized the central government, creating institutions that were directly modelled on Chinese bureaucratic structures. He established a civil service apparatus staffed partly by captured or defected Chinese scholars who knew exactly how Chinese governance worked. He sponsored the creation of a Manchu written script. He cultivated Mongol alliances through marriage ties so extensive that his state became genuinely multi-ethnic at its core. And in 1636 he made a declaration that was more than symbolic. He renamed the dynasty from later Jin to Qing, a word meaning clear or pure, deliberately distinct from the Ming, which meant bright. He gave his people a new name too, Manchu, officially retiring the older Jurchen designation. This was a rebranding with serious political intent. He was not positioning himself as a regional Jurchen warlord. He was positioning himself as a universal ruler, the kind of figure who could legitimately claim the mandate of heaven over all of China. What made the Qing different from earlier threats the Ming had faced was precisely this combination: military force that was genuinely formidable, a social organization that sustained it, and governing institutions sophisticated enough to actually administer a large population if the opportunity ever came. They were not waiting to raid China, they were waiting to rule it. By the early 1640s, the Qing had already seized large portions of Liaodong, had raided deep into the Chinese interior on multiple occasions, and had created a state that was, in almost every institutional sense, ready for a larger stage. All they needed was an opening, and as it happened, one was being prepared for them from the inside. The opening was not going to come from some single dramatic siege on the frontier. It was being carved out day by day in the quiet misery of the countryside. Imagine moving away now from the fortified passes in the northeast, away from banner camps and armoured horsemen, and walking instead into the interior of late Ming China, not the great cities with their tiled roofs and examination halls, but the long stretches of farmland that connected them. Villages that had been there for generations, built along irrigation ditches and dusty roads, where people knew the tax collector's face better than any official in the capital. The land itself is tired. Too many years of overuse, too many floods and droughts in too quick a sequence. You can picture fields that don't quite look right, rows of grain coming up patchy and thin like hair on a scar. The Yellow River has shifted its course more than once in living memory, smashing dikes, drowning villages, leaving others buried in silt. In some regions the rain has failed again and again. Crops wither. Wells sink lower. People sell tools, then animals, then land, like burning furniture to keep a failing fire alive for one more night. The Ming tax system, designed in better times, does not adjust quickly. It was supposed to be predictable, measured out in grain and labour, structured so that a village could plan around it. But as the dynasty aged and the court's needs grew more desperate, local officials leaned harder. Some, facing their own quotas and audits, insisted on full payment even when harvest failed. Others saw opportunity in the chaos, taking extra under the table, turning legal obligation into personal profit. For a peasant family already on the edge, a corrupt yamen clerk could be as deadly as a bad harvest. Debt slithers in to fill the gaps. When your granary is empty and your children's bellies swell from hunger, you borrow, from the rich household in town, from the grain merchant who has connections in the prefectural seat. You sign contracts you don't entirely understand, pledging next year's harvest, then the plot itself. Each year that the weather disappoints, the knot tightens. A late frost doesn't just mean less grain. It means the land you work, the land your grandparents cleared, now legally belongs to someone else. You stay on as a tenant, or you drift away looking for day labour, one more body on the road. Now multiply this pattern not by dozens, but by hundreds of counties, across provinces like Shanxi, Henan, Shandong. Layer on top of it something else, war. Frontier garrisons need food and silver. Campaigns against the Manchus consume horses, weapons, transport animals, men. To fund that, the state pushes harder, squeezing the same exhausted countryside that is already struggling to survive drought and flood. When bandits appear on the roads, when local strongmen start collecting protection fees, the solution from above is often the same. More levies, more demands, more pressure. Eventually something gives. In this environment, the line between bandit and rebel becomes very thin. Groups of dispossessed men gather first for simple survival. Soldiers who haven't been paid for months. Peasants who fled their villages after failing to meet impossible tax demands. Miners and labourers who lost work when local projects shut down. They begin as mobile gangs, moving through the countryside, taking what they need. But people don't move through a landscape like this without hearing stories, without picking up frustration and anger like dry leaves in their clothes. One of these men is named Li Zicheng. He's not born a legendary figure. He begins as a poor herdsman, then a mail relay worker on the Imperial post roads, one of those anonymous functionaries who keep the Empire's messages moving. At some point he serves in garrisons, part of the military machine that is supposed to hold the frontier. His early life is a catalogue of small humiliations that were common but rarely recorded. Unpaid wages, arbitrary punishment, the constant reminder that people like him are expendable. When he joins one of these roving bands in the 1630s, the countryside is already seething. There are other leaders, other banners fluttering above groups of hungry men. Some last only a season before being crushed by local militias or dissolving in quarrels over loot. What sets Li Zicheng apart is not just courage or cruelty, though he is capable of both. It's his ability to take all that scattered resentment in the interior and give it a language that sounds like justice. As his following grows, his proclamations begin to circulate. They promise the cancellation of debts. They promise that fields seized by landlords will be returned to the tillers. They promise that taxes will be light, that granaries will be opened, that people ground down by yamen runners and loan contracts will finally breathe. One of the slogans later associated with him is simple and devastating: strike the rich, aid the poor. To peasants who have watched their lives narrow to a single question, how to get enough grain to survive the next month, this is not abstract ideology. It is a lifeline. When Li's forces approach a village, some people flee, others hide, but a surprising number watch, hesitate, and then quietly bring out food, information, sons of their own who have already talked about running away to join some band or another. Suffering does not automatically produce rebellion, but it makes people listen when rebels speak. The rebel bands themselves are mobile, fluid. They move across county lines, slip through mountain passes, vanish into ravines and dry riverbeds. A regular Ming column sent to suppress them finds empty villages, trampled fields, rumours. The rebels travel light, feeding themselves off whatever they can seize. Grain, animals, sometimes entire herds driven ahead of them like moving storehouses. Wherever they pass, the local order is shaken. Magistrates flee or switch sides. Clan militias that once kept the peace now have to decide whether to defend Ming authority or cut deals with whoever has more men at their gate that week. It's important not to romanticize this too much. For many communities, the arrival of rebels is not liberation. It is another predator entering an already precarious ecology. Li Zicheng's troops and other bands like them need to eat. They need weapons and clothing. They need silver to pay followers just enough to keep them from drifting away to a rival leader. Promises of taking from the rich often translate, under pressure, into taking from whoever happens to have something worth carrying. There are accounts of villages that welcomed rebels, hoping for protection against abusive officials, only to find themselves stripped of grain and livestock when the army moved on. An army that lives off the land does not often have the luxury of being selective. One year, soldiers bearing imperial seals arrive and requisition rice and labour in the name of the Son of Heaven. The next, soldiers bearing rebel banners arrive and take in the name of justice and future relief. For the people in between, the colours of the flags may change, but the sound of doors being kicked open feels very similar. Still, stories of redistribution matter. When Li's men kill a particularly hated local landlord, when they break open a private granary or cancel tax contracts in the records office, those stories travel ahead of them. In a world where official channels have consistently failed to deliver relief, where petitions disappear into layers of bureaucracy, violent action that seems to aim downward, toward those at the bottom of the social pyramid, creates a sense of possibility. Maybe this time, the disaster will not fall entirely on the poor. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the Ming court is watching the map fill with bad news. There are uprisings in Shanxi. There are uprisings in Henan. Other rebel leaders, with names like Zhang Xianzhong, are carving their own paths of devastation through Sichuan and beyond. Each one requires troops, provisions, guns, horses, money. At the same time, the Qing to the northeast remain a constant threat, probing the borders, raiding, demanding attention. The Emperor's advisors argue about priorities. Do you pull troops from the frontier to stamp out rebellion in the interior, risking a major incursion from beyond the passes? Or do you hold the line in the northeast and trust local officials and militias to manage the rebels as best they can? The treasury is thin. Years of corruption, mismanagement, and the spiralling costs of war have drained reserves. When new taxes are proposed, they anger the very people already on the edge of revolt. When new paper money is issued, trust is low. Inflation nibbles at whatever savings remain. Some officials plead for genuine reform, for cutting palace expenditures, for cleaning up the tax system. Others focus on court factionalism, on impeachments and accusations, as if the main threat to the dynasty were still rival cliques within the bureaucracy, rather than armed men roaming the countryside. Letters arrive from provincial governors, each carrying its own urgent list of disasters. Locusts in one prefecture, bandits in another, a dike collapse that will require thousands of labourers to repair, a city besieged by rebels who claim to act in the name of justice. The court dispatches edicts and small relief funds, promotes or demotes officials, orders this general or that one to march here then there. But the scale of the crisis is now beyond what can be managed by the old tools, especially when trust in those tools has already eroded. A strange sort of paralysis sets in. The Ming can still raise armies, but they struggle to feed them. They can still appoint generals, but loyal, competent commanders are in short supply, and those who do exist are often tied up on one front when they are desperately needed on another. They can still issue proclamations, but in many counties those proclamations are read out loud to half-empty market squares because people have either fled or are too busy securing their own immediate survival to pay much attention. Out in the interior, Li Zicheng's following grows, not in a smooth, uninterrupted curve, but in pulses and lurches. A victory here, a near disaster there, a winter of hunger that almost breaks his army, followed by a spring when more desperate recruits swell his ranks than he can even properly arm. His movement is not simply a band of outlaws anymore. It is turning unevenly into a rival claim to authority. He begins to adopt titles that echo those of legitimate rulers. He sets up rough administrations in the territories he controls, collects his own taxes, issues his own orders. These structures are often improvised and harsh, but they mark a shift. He is no longer just preying on the Ming. He is beginning to imagine replacing them. For the Qing, watching from beyond the passes, this spreading internal fire is not just a distant disturbance. It is the crack in the wall they have been waiting for. But before their chance comes, another figure must take the stage, standing at the very point where empire, rebellion, and foreign power will collide. On the northeastern frontier, at a strategic choke point called Shanhai Pass, a Ming general named Wu Sangui is trying to hold the line. Wu Sangui is not born a traitor. That label will come later, pinned to him by people who have the luxury of looking backward. In the 1640s, he is something more ordinary, and in some ways more complicated. A professional soldier from a military family, trying to keep his balance while the ground under him is starting to crack. He grows up in a world of border smoke and marching boots. His father and grandfather both hold military posts. The Wu clan's status is tied not to elegant essays or high examination scores, but to the ability to raise men, hold walls, and deliver victories. In a court dominated by scholar officials, this makes them useful, but also somewhat separate, part of a parallel hierarchy of frontier power. From a young age, Wu Sangui's career follows the expected path. He learns horsemanship, archery, the handling of troops. He's posted to the north, where the Ming state has spent decades building a massive defensive system. Walls, forts, passes, and the garrisons to man them. There, his talent earns him promotions. He develops a reputation for toughness, for discipline, for the ability to keep his units together even when pay is late and supplies are thin. The Ming need men like this. The enemy beyond the passes is no longer just a loose coalition of steppe raiders. By the time Wu Sangui's name appears in the records, the urchins to the northeast have already reorganized themselves, taken the name Manchu, and begun calling their state the Qing. They have banners, ranks, a court, a capital beyond the Liao River. They are not just harassing the border, they are building an alternative empire. This is the edge where Wu Sangui lives and works. Shanhai Pass, the position he eventually commands, is more than just a fort with a gate in it. If you imagine the Great Wall not as a single unbroken line, but as a series of linked defences running along mountain ridges and valleys, Shanhai is one of the key locks in that chain. It sits where the mountains drop toward the Bohai Sea, at a narrow corridor that connects the northeastern plains to the North China heartland. To the east and north of Shanhai, you move into the territories where the Manchus ride. To the west and south, you're in the old Ming Core, the region that feeds Beijing and supports the court. Whoever controls Shanhai controls one of the easiest doors between these two worlds. Wu Sangui spends years there and around it, learning its strengths and its weaknesses the way a farmer learns the moods of his field. He knows how many men he can actually put on the walls, as opposed to what the official rosters say. He knows how much grain is really in the granaries, how much powder is dry, which subordinate officers can be trusted, which are quietly padding their numbers and pocketing the difference. From the capital's perspective, he is one of their better bets, a loyal general on the frontier, tied to the dynasty not only by salary and rank but by honour and personal relationship. Sources from later years mention that a close member of his family, a beloved concubine in some tellings, relatives in others, lives in Beijing. Whether every detail of those stories is accurate is hard to prove, but it fits a larger pattern. Successful generals are woven into the fabric of the court through marriages, titles, and favours. His loyalty is not simple, though. Very few loyalties ever are. On paper, Wu Sangui is a servant of the Ming, sworn to defend the dynasty that gave his family its status. He wears their armour, receives their edicts, fights their enemies. In practice, he also owes a direct, fierce allegiance to the men under his command. Thousands of soldiers and their families depend on the decisions he makes. They sleep in barracks along the wall, plant small plots outside the fort, send portions of their pay, when it comes, to aging parents in distant villages. Every time he receives an order from Beijing to move this unit or that, to strip troops from his posts and send them inland to fight rebels, he has to weigh Imperial command against what he knows of the actual situation on the ground. If he obeys too literally, he risks leaving critical defences thin, exposing his own people to raids from the northeast. If he disobeys or delays, he risks impeachment, disgrace, even execution. Layered on top of this is another quieter loyalty: family. The Wu clan's fortunes are tied to him. His father's rank, his brother's prospects, his household's safety in the capital and in their native place all rest on how well he navigates this dangerous period. If the dynasty survives and he is seen as loyal, the Wu name prospers. If the dynasty falls and he is seen as having been on the wrong side, they may all pay. And then there is the most basic loyalty of all, which people do not always name, but which presses on everyone living through crisis: the instinct to protect one's own survival. Not in the narrow sense of saving one's skin at any cost, but in the broader sense of trying to ensure that when the dust settles, when one banner or another flies over Beijing, there is still a place in the new order for you and yours. From Shanhai Pass, Wu Sangui looks in three directions at once. To the west, messages come from Beijing, urgent seals impressed on silk and paper, commanding him to hold firm, to send reinforcements against Li Zicheng's rebels, to trust that the Son of Heaven will restore order. The edicts talk about righteousness, duty, cosmic balance. Some likely arrive with promises, extra honours if he performs well, perhaps vague assurances about future rewards. To the south and southwest, word filters in from the interior. Reports of cities falling to rebels, of officials fleeing or killed, of tax circuits collapsing, relay stations abandoned, grain stores opening without imperial permission. These messages are often less formal. Letters from friends, rumours carried by merchants, even casual talk among soldiers whose relatives back home are sending desperate notes begging for help. The picture they paint is of a dynasty that is not just under pressure but fraying. And to the northeast he watches the Manchus. He knows their power is not theoretical. Over the years they have won pitched battles against Ming armies. They have raided deep into Chinese territory, taking captives, seizing livestock, burning villages. Yet they have also, at times, negotiated, offered truces, tried to pry frontier commanders away from the Ming with promises of rank and land under a new regime. Wu Sangui may very well have received feelers, direct or indirect, from the Qing court. Join us, open your gates, be the first hero of a new dynasty rather than one of the last defenders of a dying one. Later stories will certainly say so, although the exact words and timing are hard to know. For now, standing at Shanhai, he refuses to simply submit. His official stance remains one of Ming loyalty. He fights Manchu incursions. He maintains the defences. He sends memorials to Beijing describing what he needs to hold the line. At the same time, his position is becoming more critical with each month that passes. As rebel armies like Li Zicheng's erode Ming control from the inside, the court's ability to send reliable reinforcements to the frontier shrinks. Some garrisons go unpaid. Some posts are abandoned. Shanhai Pass, with Wu Sangui's relatively disciplined troops and its strategic location, starts to look less like one strong point among many, and more like one of the last real locks on the northeastern door. By the early 1640s, there are very few figures who can, by a single decision, significantly change the balance among Ming, rebel and Manchu forces. Wu Sangui is one of them. If he stays firmly Ming, holding Shanhai against any outside force, the Qing face a hard, bloody campaign just to get a foothold past the wall. If he were ever to abandon his post or turn his coat, the path from the steppe into the North China Plain opens far wider. Later generations looking back will compress all of this into a single moment. Wu Sangui opening a gate. They will argue about his motivations. Some will call him a villain beyond redemption, the man who brought the barbarians into China for private reasons, perhaps revenge for an insult or the death of a loved one in rebel-held Beijing. They will curse his name, write plays where he is the model of treachery, use him as a cautionary example of failed loyalty in moral essays. Others will paint him as a tragic figure, a general caught between a collapsing dynasty that could no longer protect its people, rebel forces that promised justice but often delivered chaos, and an ascendant Qing regime that, whatever else it was, offered order and survival. In this reading, his choice, when it eventually comes, is not a simple betrayal, but a desperate calculation in a world where all options are stained. Both memories say more about the needs of those later storytellers than about the precise thoughts in Wu Sangui's mind as he walks the walls of Shanhai Pass, watching smoke rise on distant horizons. For the moment, in the spring of 1644, he's still at his post, still nominally a Ming general, still holding the gate between northeast and North China. He does not yet know that within weeks Li Zicheng's banners will be flying over Beijing, and the emperor he serves will be dead. When that happens, the web of loyalties that has guided him so far, dynasty, family, soldiers, self, will snap all at once, leaving him to make a choice that will echo for centuries. Li Zicheng does not look like the man who will walk into an imperial capital. He starts, years earlier, as something much more ordinary in a broken system. A minor functionary turned soldier, then a deserter, then a bandit chief in the hungry heartland of the Ming. His followers call him the dashing king. What they mean by that is less about charm and more about movement. He moves quickly, striking where the state is weakest, appearing and vanishing with the seasons of famine and tax collection. By the early 1640s, his rebellion has swollen beyond the scale of simple banditry. Whole regions in the northwest drift out of Ming control and into his orbit. County magistrates, faced with empty granaries and unpaid soldiers, decide that handing over their seals to Li's envoys is safer than resisting. Some do it out of conviction, believing the Ming mandate has rotted. Others simply calculate that it is better to bend than be trampled. His movement gathers layers as it goes. Disgruntled peasants who have seen their fields wither under drought and locusts, disbanded soldiers who were sent home without pay, local toughs who once extorted travellers at roadside inns now find that rebellion offers a bigger stage. Even failed exam candidates show up in his camp, men who can quote the classics and write proclamations promising equal fields and just taxes if Li's rule is accepted. Calling it a peasant rebellion is a simplification. It is more like a loose, violent coalition of the discontented, held together by charisma, opportunity, and the simple fact that many regions no longer feel the distant emperor can protect them. By 1643, Li Zicheng is no longer just harassing provinces on the periphery. His forces have taken major cities in the northwest and are moving steadily east. Each victory gives him more weapons, more grain, more coerced recruits. Each surrender sends a message. Imperial authority can be negotiated with or simply ignored. Inside Beijing, that message arrives in fragments. Court memorials reach the Chongzhen Emperor's desk stacked in uneasy piles. Reports of lost prefectures, of generals defeated or worse defected, of granaries opened by rebels, sometimes with the applause of local populations who see more food in Li's camp than they have seen from the court in years. Chongzhen reads, becomes furious, issues executions, promotions, emergency edicts. He's not a lazy or indifferent ruler. Many historians describe him as hard-working, even harsh on himself and others. But hard work is not the same as effective control, especially when the machinery under you is already grinding itself apart. He tries to pull capable generals from one front to patch another. He orders Wu Sangui and others to send troops inward to block Li's advance. But distances are long, supplies are short, and local commanders do their own calculations. Some drag their feet, some outright disobey, some send reports full of optimistic numbers that hide how hollow their units have become. Meanwhile, Li Zicheng is learning to read the empire the way Wu Sangui reads the frontier. He understands that the capital, though ringed by walls and garrisons, is fed by a fragile network of grain routes and political loyalties. If he can break those, the walls themselves become much less formidable. In early 1644 he pushes east with speed that shocks observers. Towns and cities fall in rapid succession, some after token resistance, some with almost none. When his forces break through the passes west of Beijing, the reality at the capital shifts from distant concern to immediate fear. Imagine the city in those days. Beijing has been the Ming capital for nearly 3 centuries. Its palaces, temples, and markets sit within a layered system of walls. The outer city, the inner city, the forbidden city at the centre. Officials ride to court at dawn in sedan chairs. Artisans hammer at bronze and jade in their workshops. Students crowd into examination halls to write essays on loyalty and governance. Beneath that surface, anxiety has been building for years. Grain prices have climbed. Rumours of rebel armies circulate in tea-houses and alleyways. Now, in the spring of 1644, the rumours become more precise. People start hearing place names they recognise. Datong, Taiyuan, cities that sit frighteningly close to the approaches leading north. Refugees begin to trickle in, then pour. They bring stories of city gates forced, of local gentries kneeling to present keys, of granaries broken open in the name of justice. Some say Li Zicheng rewards discipline, punishing his own men if they loot without permission. Others describe chaos and burning. The truth is likely a mix, differing from place to place. But for residents of Beijing, nuance matters less than the overall impression. The outer defences of the dynasty are unravelling. Inside the court, panic and paralysis mix in equal measure. The Chongzhen Emperor convenes emergency councils. One plan suggests abandoning Beijing and retreating south to Nanjing, the old capital, to regroup around the lower Yangtze, where there is still wealth and manpower. Another faction insists that the Son of Heaven must not flee. To do so would shatter morale and make any claim to legitimacy weaker. Some urge a final battle in the open field. Others advise pulling the best troops into the city and preparing for a siege. Behind every recommendation is not just strategy, but fear. Fear of being associated with the wrong choice if it fails. Orders go out to summon Wu Sangui's frontier army back toward the capital. If his disciplined troops can reach Beijing in time, they might stiffen the city's defences by precious weeks, perhaps months. But messengers and armies both move on roads that are already clogged with refugees and scattered soldiers. Timing becomes everything. Li Zicheng does not wait. In April 1644, his forces reached the vicinity of Beijing. The Ming defences intended to delay him. Fortifications, local garrisons, outer strongholds proved brittle. Years of corruption, unpaid salaries, hollowed-out units mean that on the day they are truly tested, many of these positions simply give way. Some commanders surrender, some flee, a few fight and are crushed. From the city walls, people can see dust on the horizon that is not from spring wind, but from marching columns. The last days inside Beijing have the feeling of a house, realizing the fire is already in the walls. Officials rush to the palace with petitions begging the emperor to flee south. Others instead lobby for permission to defend to the death. Some simply stay home, quietly packing valuables, calculating how they might survive under a new regime. The examination students, scholars in training for a state that may not exist next month, whisper to each other in courtyards, trying to read the omens. Chongzhen vacillates, and the window for orderly flight closes. Rebel forces cut roads. Communications grow patchier. Imperial commands issued in the morning are rendered irrelevant by afternoon developments. When Li Zicheng's army finally presses up to the city, the Ming garrison's morale is already fractured. There is some fighting at the outer walls and gates, cannon thunder, arrows fly. But the defenders are not a single coherent force united by confidence in victory. They are tired soldiers with uncertain pay, watching their superiors argue, hearing rumours that frontier troops will not arrive in time if at all. At some point, it may have been bribery, fear, or pure collapse, a critical gate is opened, or a section of the defences is abandoned. Accounts differ on the precise sequence, but the result is not in doubt. Rebel troops pour in. The city that has symbolised imperial order for generations suddenly becomes a battlefield. In the palace, the sound of distant fighting seeps through courtyards that once echoed with ritual music. The Chongzhen emperor moves through the forbidden city in a haze of desperate motion. He orders the crown prince and other family members to flee and hide if they can. He summons servants, then drives them away. He berates ministers, and then apologizes. Some reports say he takes up a sword, intending to lead a last defense. Others have him wandering through the palace grounds in tears, muttering that he has failed heaven. There is a moment somewhere in those final hours when he seems to grasp that there will be no rescue, no miraculous counterattack from loyal generals, no thunderbolt from the sky to scatter Li Zicheng's forces. The dynasty he inherited is not going to be saved by a single stroke of resolve. He chooses, then, to end it himself. Before dawn on April 25th, 1644, the emperor slips out of the inner palace with a small number of attendants. They make their way through the dark toward Coal Hill, the artificial mound just north of the Forbidden City, built in earlier days from the earth dug for palace moats and lakes. On that hill, beneath twisted trees, he writes or speaks a few last words. Some sources preserve a brief note blaming himself for failing both his ancestors and his people, acknowledging that the mandate has been lost. Whether the exact phrasing is reliable is hard to prove, but the gesture itself fits a pattern deeply embedded in Chinese political culture. A ruler accepting cosmic responsibility for disaster. He then hangs himself from a tree. When rebel soldiers fan out through the palace complex later that morning, they find the Son of Heaven no longer on the throne, but suspended from a branch, robes stained with dirt and dew. His death does not stop the looting that follows, but it marks a symbolic boundary. For contemporaries, this is the moment when the Ming, as a dynasty ruling from Beijing, ends. Li Zicheng enters the city not as a mere bandit, but as a self-proclaimed new ruler. He issues proclamations declaring the end of Ming misrule and the beginning of a more just era. He orders that looting be limited, that officials and commoners submit calmly and be spared. In some neighbourhoods, this works. Markets reopen cautiously. City residents line up to see the dashing king, curious about the man who has toppled a 276-year-old regime. But order won by sudden conquest is fragile. Some of Li's followers, flush with victory, treat Beijing as a prize to be consumed. They seize goods, occupy mansions, settle old grudges. Ming officials who do not switch allegiance quickly enough are arrested, beaten, sometimes killed. The new court must be staffed, but there are not enough experienced administrators loyal to Li to run a capital of this size smoothly. Merchants hesitate to bring in grain. Tax records are in disarray. Military units loyal to Li exist, but they are spread thin, garrisoning a city whose population far outnumbers them. Outside the walls, other rebel bands not under Li's tight control lurk like wolves at the edge of a campfire. Beijing has fallen, but it has not been securely claimed. For Wu Sangui, still at Shanhai Pass, the news of these events comes in jagged fragments. An imperial courier brings word of the emperor's death. Another report claims Li Zicheng has already begun styling himself as ruler, sending out edicts under a new reign title. Rumours swirl that Li has taken hostages from the families of frontier generals in Beijing, perhaps including Wu's own. The old equation shatters. Loyalty to the Ming court no longer means service to a living emperor in the capital. The court has become a memory, or a scattering of princes and officials trying to reconstitute authority elsewhere. The banner over Beijing is now rebel, not imperial. And beyond the passes, the Manchus watch all of this unfold with careful attention. In the streets of the capital, the fall feels sudden. One week the Vermilion gates are still guarded by Ming soldiers, the next they are patrolled by men wearing the colours of a rebel king. But if you pull back, stretching the timeline beyond these frantic days, the picture changes. The collapse in Beijing is a last snap in a rope that has been fraying for decades. Through fiscal strain, natural disasters, factional court politics, frontier pressures, and the everyday grinding misery of subjects who finally decided that imperial promises no longer match their reality. In the spring of 1644, that long, slow unravelling condenses into a few hours on a dark hill, a dead emperor beneath a tree, and a city whose walls no longer belong to the dynasty that built them. The fall of Beijing does not end the Ming story everywhere, and it does not yet guarantee a Qing victory, but it creates a vacuum at the empire's heart. And into that vacuum, other forces, rebel, frontier and Manchu, will soon move, each convinced for a moment that they can shape what comes next. Shanhai Pass is not just a gate in the wall, it is an ending point and a hinge point at the same time. Behind Wu Sangui to the south and west lies the heartland of the Ming he was raised to serve, now without a living emperor in its capital. Ahead of him to the northeast lies the Manchu power he has been fighting for years. Beneath his feet is the narrow corridor where the Great Wall meets the sea, a bottleneck through which armies must pass if they want to move between the steppe and the plain. He cannot simply hold his position and wait. The world beyond the walls has shifted too fast for that. In the days after Beijing falls, the messages that reach Wu are confused and often contradictory. One rider brings word of Chongzhen's suicide. Another reports that Li Zicheng has proclaimed a new regime and ordered frontier generals to submit. A third claims that some Ming princes have fled south, perhaps to Nanjing, perhaps somewhere along the lower Yangtze, raising banners in the old imperial colours. He's not just a man with a personal dilemma. He's a commander with tens of thousands of troops, supplies, families and dependents, clustered around one of the most critical passes in northern China. Every hour he delays choosing a direction, his position becomes more precarious. On paper, his choices are simple. In reality, none of them are. One path is surrender to Li Zicheng, accept the new reality in Beijing, hand over the pass in exchange for rank, titles, maybe confirmation of his control over certain territories. Many officials are doing some version of this calculation. Dynasties fall, new ones rise. Men who switch allegiances at the right moment can die as honoured ministers instead of disgraced loyalists. Another path is withdrawal south, abandon the pass, march his army toward whatever Ming remnant survives on the lower Yangtze, and hope to rebuild resistance there. That would mean turning his back on the barrier that shields the plain from the northeast. It would also mean marching through territory where loyalties are uncertain and supplies even more so. A third path is the most shocking. Ally with the Manchus he's been fighting, and invite them through Shanhai Pass. Later chroniclers will try to compress this tangle of strategic options into a single clear emotion. They like the story in which Wu Sangui's decision is all about revenge. In that version, the news that truly breaks him is not just the emperor's death or the fall of Beijing, it is what has happened to his household inside the city. Wu's family, like those of many high commanders, had been living in Beijing as a kind of insurance policy for the court. When Li Zicheng enters the capital, his men seize the families of prominent generals as hostages. Among them, according to later accounts, is a famous courtesan named Chen Yuan, a woman celebrated for her beauty and singing voice, who has become Wu Sangui's favoured companion or concubine. The most widely repeated story goes like this. Li Zicheng either takes Chen Yuan for himself, or allows his followers to do so. When the news reaches Wu at Shanhai Pass, he is enraged beyond calculation. One version has him shouting, My head can be given up, but my beauty cannot be humiliated. Another describes him pacing in fury, torn between hatred for Li and residual loyalty to the fallen Ming. These stories are vivid. They give the decision at the pass a face and a name. They turn the opening of a gate that reshaped China into something almost like the plot of a romance drama. A general so consumed by personal grievance that he throws the empire's doors to foreign invaders. But when you step back and compare the accounts, the edges blur. Chen Yuanyuan was real. She appears in contemporary records before 1644 as a renowned performer in the Jiangnan region, later associated with Wu Sangui's household. There are indications that her fate during the fall of Beijing was indeed tangled up with Li Zicheng's forces, but the precise scenes, the dramatic cries, the exact humiliation, the moment when news of her treatment supposedly tipped Wu's heart, are much harder to pin down. Many of the most colourful details appear in sources written decades later, under the Qing, when Wu Sangui had become a convenient symbol. For some, he was the great traitor who opened the gates to northeastern conquerors. For others, especially in popular fiction and opera, he was a tragic, conflicted figure caught between love, loyalty and survival. In both cases, the story of Chen Yuanyuan provided a useful narrative hook. It fit existing cultural patterns. Chinese historical storytelling often attaches vast political shifts to intimate episodes. A tyrant distracted by a concubine, a minister moved by a poem, a general enraged by an insult. These moments are not always invented out of whole cloth, but they are often polished until they gleam more brightly than the slower, less dramatic forces in the background. So when we picture Wu Sangui at Shanhai Pass, hearing about Chen Yuanyuan, it may be closer to truth to think of that story as one thread in a tangled skein, not the single cord that pulls him to a decision. What else is pulling? There is his long-standing identity as a Ming commander. He has spent his adult life fighting in the Imperial name, defending the northern frontier. His personal status, his family's honour, his network of subordinates and allies, all of it is bound up with the idea of serving the dynasty. Now the Son of Heaven is dead, but the moral vocabulary he has lived in does not disappear overnight. Concepts like loyalty and righteousness still matter, even as their practical reference points shift. Li Zicheng's new regime in Beijing, from Wu's perspective, is not a gentle restoration of order. It is a bandit court set up on the ruins of the palace he once guarded from afar. Reports of confiscations, of rough treatment of officials, of chaotic administration filter through. Some may be exaggerated or shaped by frightened loyalists. Some may reflect very real chaos. In either case, it is not surprising if Wu weighs the prospect of serving under Li and finds it bitter. By contrast, the Manchus, though foreign, present themselves differently. Their leader in the field, the regent Dorgon, sends messages pledging to avenge the fallen Ming emperor and punish the rebel usurpers in Beijing. Manchu proclamations around this time are carefully phrased, emphasizing that they are not bandits but avengers of order, protectors of those who remain loyal to the old dynasty's memory. Wu has fought them and knows they are dangerous, but he also knows they are disciplined, unified, and possessed of a coherent command structure. They have cavalry, experienced officers, and a clear political project: conquer the Middle Kingdom and claim the mandate of heaven. In a landscape where the central court has imploded and Li Zicheng's hold on Beijing is shaky, that kind of clarity has its own appeal, so we can imagine Wu's mind working along at least 3 different tracks. One is personal: fury and grief over his family's capture, over Chen Yuanyuan's rumoured fate, over humiliation at the hands of someone he sees as a rebel upstart. Another is loyalist: the sense that Li Zicheng's rule is illegitimate, a usurpation that disrespects the Ming line, and that assisting the Manchus in toppling him can be framed, at least initially, as an act of posthumous loyalty to Chongzhen. The third is brutally pragmatic, a calculation about which side is more likely to win, and where his own survival and future influence might lie. From that angle, throwing in with the Manchus at a critical choke point gives him bargaining power. If he opens the gate at the right moment and helps break Li Zicheng, he becomes indispensable to whatever new order emerges. Different historians weigh these motives differently. Some emphasize the revenge story, citing later accounts that linger on Chen Yuanyuan. Others stress the loyalist rhetoric in Wu's early proclamations, seeing him as a man who could not stomach serving a rebel regime. Still others point to the underlying military reality. His army was caught between a growing rebel power in Beijing and a formidable Manchu force beyond the wall. Aligning decisively with one against the other may have seemed like the only plausible way to avoid being crushed between them. What seems reasonably clear is that when Manchu and Wu Sangui's forces eventually coordinate at Shanhai Pass, the conflict that follows is not a minor skirmish. It is a battle in which the rebel army that has just taken Beijing is decisively defeated. Li Zicheng's aura of unstoppable momentum shatters. His hold on the capital is fatally weakened. The opening of the pass is not just a gate creaking on its hinges. It is a pressure valve releasing the Manchu military into the North China Plain at exactly the moment when the Ming center has collapsed and the rebel regime has not yet solidified. Whatever mixture of love, rage, loyalty and calculation swirled inside Wu Sangui's chest that spring, the effect of his choice ripples outward far beyond him. It reshapes the balance of power across an entire continent-sized empire. It gives the Manchus not only a road into the heartland, but a story, that they came south as avengers, invited by a great Ming general to punish rebels and restore order. Later generations will argue over whether Wu was a patriot, a traitor, an opportunist, or some uneasy combination of all three. But from the moment the alliance takes form and the gate at Shanhai Pass is effectively opened, one thing is hard to dispute. The fate of China's next centuries has begun to tip in a new direction, one that neither Li Zicheng nor Chongzhen, nor perhaps even Wu himself fully imagined when they first stepped onto the stage. Dorgon does not ride into this story like a sudden storm. He's been gathering on the horizon for years. By 1644, he's not just a prince of the rising Manchu state. He is its regent, the man directing armies in the field in the name of a child emperor, the Shunji emperor, who is still too young to command. Behind Dorgon stands a hardened cavalry force, men who have been fighting, raiding and besieging on China's northern borders since before Wu Sangui was born. He knows what he wants. He wants the mandate. But wanting the mandate and getting it are different things. The Manchus have pushed deep into Ming territory before, taken cities, extracted tribute, forced humiliating treaties. Each time they have withdrawn again, holding their northeastern base and waiting for a better opening. When Chongzhen hangs himself on Coal Hill, when Li Zicheng's banners flutter over Beijing's walls, that opening yawns wider than anything Dorgon has seen. From his camp beyond the Great Wall, the messages reach him just as they reach Wu Sangui. Though from different directions, the emperor is dead, the capital has fallen. A peasant-turned rebel now sits in the Forbidden City. Dorgon understands immediately that this is not just someone else's disaster, it is an opportunity, but it is also a trap. If he simply hurls his cavalry at the newly taken capital, he risks slamming into a still intact rebel army fortified behind Beijing's walls. If he waits too long, Li Zicheng might consolidate power, rally former Ming troops to his banner, and present a more unified resistance. The perfect moment is a brief one, a narrow window between collapse and consolidation. Into that narrow window, Wu Sangui sends his plea. The exact wording of their exchanges is murky. Letters were written, messengers rode back and forth, promises were made. Different chronicles preserve different versions. But the broad outline is consistent. A frontier commander, holding one of the most strategic passes, offers cooperation to the Manchu regent against the rebels in Beijing. For Dorgon, this changes everything. With Wu's help, the problem of the pass disappears. Instead of hurling men at high walls guarded by artillery and entrenched infantry, Dorgon can march through Shanhai Pass with a Ming army at his side. Instead of appearing as an invader against all Chinese alike, he can claim to be marching with a loyal Ming general to avenge the fallen emperor. This is not just tactics, it is storycraft. Mandate of heaven politics live on narrative as much as on steel. A dynastic founder needs not only victories, but a justification. Dorgon has already begun to frame the Manchu cause as righteous, avenging wrongs, suppressing bandits, restoring order. Wu Sangui's alliance lets him anchor that story in an appealing way. A respected Ming commander besieged by rebels calls upon them for aid. The Manchus respond. Later proclamations will lean heavily on this angle. They will emphasize that the Manchu armies did not arbitrarily descend upon the North China Plain, but were invited in by loyalists. Before any of that rhetoric can solidify, though, there is a practical question to solve. How do you actually link two armies that, days earlier, were enemies across a fortified frontier? Shanhai Pass is a stone throat. On one side, Manchu cavalry and banners. On the other, Wu Sangui's garrison, Ming flags still formally flying. Beyond, the open plains leading back toward Beijing, where Li Zicheng's men are spreading out like ink on paper. Accounts differ about the precise choreography of the alliance. Some sources imagine formal meetings, ceremonial bows, speeches in tents. Others suggest a more rushed, improvised coordination under tight timelines. What seems plausible is that both sides move quickly, because the danger of delay was obvious. If Li Zicheng could strike first, if he could send a strong force to crush Wu at the pass before the Manchus arrived in full strength, he might slam the gate closed and buy himself breathing room. If Dorgon and Wu joined too slowly, each might face rebel attacks separately and be defeated in turn. So the two men who days ago would have happily seen each other dead now find their fortunes braided together. On the eve of their combined march, the pass itself must have felt like a coiled spring. Wu's troops, Chinese infantry and cavalry exhausted by years of frontier war, now preparing to fight under the eye of their former enemy. Manchu bannermen, horse archers from the steppe and forest checking tack and armour, listening to orders shouted in languages many of Wu's men did not understand. Some officers likely grumbled that this was treachery. Others may have felt relief that, at last, there was a clear direction. Fight the rebels, side with the avengers, let tomorrow's problems wait. When the alliance finally moves, it moves hard. Li Zicheng has not ignored Shanhai Pass. He knows that if the gateway to the northeast remains in hostile hands, his regime in Beijing will always be under threat. He sends a substantial force eastward, aiming to pull Wu Sangui into his orbit or break him by force. There are different reconstructions of the ensuing clash. Numbers vary, maneuvers are disputed, but in broad shape the Battle of Shanhai Pass takes form as a convergence. Wu Sangui's Ming troops and Dorgon's Manchu cavalry on one side, rebel forces loyal to Li Zicheng on the other, colliding in the narrow corridor where mountains, wall and sea squeeze everything together. You can imagine the rhythm of it, even if the precise details are lost. Early volleys of gunfire from Wu's side, matchlock muskets cracking, cannon dug into earthworks near the past-pounding rebel formations as they approach. The rebels, experienced from years of movement across the interior, not strangers to battle either, pushing forward in waves thinking they face only a Ming frontier army. Then the moment when the Manchu cavalry sweeps in. This is where Dorgon's forces excel. Fast-moving horsemen, used to coordinating in large formations, bows bending in practiced arcs. They are not invincible, but in open or semi-open terrain they are terrifying, especially to infantry caught in the wrong position. Some witnesses later claim that a dust storm blew up during the battle, obscuring vision, causing confusion in rebel ranks. Others frame the storm, if it occurred, as almost an omen, heaven itself intervening. Whether literal dust or just the metaphorical fog of war, what emerges from the sources is a sense of disorientation among Li Zicheng's men when the Manchu contingent strike. Instead of facing a single enemy, they find themselves trapped between bombardment from Wu's entrenched positions and the flanking maneuvers of Manchu horsemen. Units break. Lines that might have held against one foe begin to crumble when confronted by two cooperating forces, Somewhere on that field, the idea of inevitability snaps. Only weeks before, Li Ziqing had seemed unstoppable, the man who took Beijing, the breaker of a 276-year dynasty. At Shanhai Pass, he suffers a defeat sharp enough that he cannot simply shrug it off. His commanders pull back in disorder. In the confusion that follows, coordination frays. He will abandon Beijing not long after, slipping out of the city rather than standing in it as the combined armies advance. For Dorgon, the victory is immense but incomplete. He has cracked open the shell around the North China Plain. The pass is not just open, it is in friendly hands. The principal rebel army in the region has been bloodied badly and pushed back. On paper, the road lies clear from the pass toward Beijing and beyond. Yet what lies ahead is not an empty landscape waiting passively for rule. It is a shattered heartland filled with hungry soldiers, displaced peasants, wary local elites, and scattered Ming loyalists. There are still Ming princes at large in the south. There are other rebel bands in the countryside. There is no guarantee that the Manchus can move in and seamlessly replace one dynasty with another. Dorgon knows this. The battle has given him a corridor and a justification, not yet a country. When he rides west after Shanhai Pass toward the capital he has never ruled but long imagined, he does so as a regent with a powerful army, a Ming general on his side, and a story that says he comes to avenge chaos, not to create it. The mandate of heaven, in the language of the time, has not yet visibly settled on any one house, but the scales have tilted. The moment when the rebels might have solidified control of the north has passed. The moment when the Manchus can present themselves as rescuers, at least to some, has arrived. Shanhai Pass has done its work. It has taken a struggle that might have remained a contest between rebels and fallen Ming, and turned it into something else. The opening act of a conquest that will, in time, be remembered as the founding of a new imperial line. The empire is not yet theirs, but the decisive break has occurred. From here on, every city that surrenders, every official who pledges loyalty, every banner that changes colour, will do so in the shadow of the choice made at that narrow stone throat between mountain and sea, and the regent who seized his moment when the gates swung wide. When Dorgon's army finally approaches Beijing, it is not the city that Li Ziqing entered. The rebel regime has barely had time to unpack its baggage. Troops have looted, officials have fled, the court has scattered. Li himself is already on the move, slipping out with a diminished force, leaving behind a capital that feels more like a crime scene than a throne room. The gates open to the Manchus without the titanic siege one might imagine. Wu Sangui's cooperation, Li Ziqing's retreat, and the shock of the recent fall all combine to hollow the city out before Dorgon rides in. Even so, crossing that threshold is not a simple matter of planting a banner and declaring victory. Armies can occupy walls and palaces. Ruling an empire is something different. When Dorgon enters Beijing, the Forbidden City still carries the ghosts of the Ming. The last emperor's blood has barely dried on Coal Hill. The bureaucracy that once managed grain shipments, tax ledgers, and river defences is in disarray. City residents have endured sack, panic, and hunger in rapid succession. Trust has evaporated. Into this fractured space, a new regime has to be built. On paper, the solution is straightforward. The Manchus have their own ruling house already. The Isenjioro clan has an emperor, albeit a child, the Shunji Emperor, waiting in the northeast. Move him into the old Ming capital, proclaim a new dynasty, declare that the mandate of heaven having abandoned the Ming has now alighted on the Qing. But mandates do not become real just because someone writes them on a proclamation. Dorgon understands that if the Qing are to be more than a passing conqueror, they need continuity as much as rupture. They must look like a replacement for the Ming, not just another band of raiders passing through the central plain. So the first steps after occupation are slower, more bureaucratic than dramatic. Former Ming officials, many of them hiding in their homes or lingering anxiously on the margins of power, begin to receive messages. Some are summoned to audience, some are approached quietly through intermediaries. The new rulers want help, not just help in name, help in practice. They need men who know which granary keys fit which storerooms, who know how to interpret local tax registers, who remember the obligations owed to and by each county and province. They need expertise in how to run a Chinese empire, and the Ming literati possess it. For those officials, the moment is excruciating. They have spent their lives steeped in loyalty to a fallen house. Many sat for the examinations under the Ming, wrote essays on Ming classics, wore Ming robes when they entered court. Now the banners flying over the gate are different. The accents of the soldiers in the streets are foreign. Some refuse outright. They mourn, they withdraw. Some eventually join loyalist courts in the south, or retreat into rural obscurity. Later memory will celebrate the most steadfast among them as paragons of integrity. Others hesitate, then bend. They tell themselves that someone has to keep the machine of governance running, that peasants still need taxes collected in an orderly way rather than by marauding troops, that canals still need dredging and dikes still need repair, or famine and flood will follow conquest like a shadow. They accept posts under the new regime. They draft documents in careful classical Chinese announcing what is, from one angle, their own capitulation. When the Shunji Emperor is formally enthroned in Beijing, it is these men, alongside Manchu nobles and banner commanders, who provide the ritual skeleton that makes the ceremony look like a continuation of imperial practice rather than an alien imposition. He is a child, seated where grown Ming emperors once sat, surrounded by Manchu regents and a sprinkling of newly re-employed Chinese grand secretaries and ministers. Ritual dances, formal oaths, the reading of era names and dynastic titles, all of this is pulled from a shared repertoire that stretches back centuries. The message is deliberate. The dynasty has changed, but the idea of empire has not. The throne is occupied, the sacrifices to heaven and earth will continue, the machinery of state is being restarted under new management. Outside the palace, however, legitimacy looks less like a coronation and more like negotiation. Local elites, the gentry families, the lineage heads, the men who quietly run county academies and granaries, find themselves approached by Manchu and Mongol commanders holding real power but lacking local roots. Cooperation is not always dressed up as a choice. Sometimes it comes at the end of a spear. Yet even under the shadow of force, there is bargaining. A village headman might agree to provide grain and labourers in exchange for guarantees that his fields will not be trampled by cavalry. A county notable might accept a sub-prefect posting under the Qing in return for protection against rival rebel bands. A scholar might compose a placid-sounding peace proclamation, encouraging locals to submit to prevent harsher measures. Across the North China Plain, this patchwork of arrangements, concessions, and quiet deals is what allows the new regime to function day by day, not just raw conquest, but a web of accommodations. At the same time, the Qing court begins to send signals of power, of difference, and of how far they expect their new subjects to bend. One of the most visible is the Q order. Under the Ming, hair and clothing had long been cultural anchors, markers of identity. The Manchus bring with them their own styles, and more importantly, their own understanding of what hair signifies in terms of obedience and incorporation. The order requires Han Chinese men to shave the front of their heads and wear the remaining hair in a long braid, in the Manchu fashion. The slogan that echoes through later retellings captures the starkness of the demand. Keep your hair and lose your head, or cut your hair and keep your head. Enforcement varies by region and time, but in the early years resistance can be deadly. Some communities refuse, seeing the enforced hairstyle as humiliation, a visible mark of submission to a foreign power. In places this sparks uprisings that are brutally suppressed. Elsewhere, people comply through gritted teeth. Over time, the queue becomes so normalized that later generations will treat it as almost synonymous with traditional Chinese male appearance. But in these first decades, it is a bleeding edge of cultural tension. Every shaved forehead in a market street is both an assertion of Qing authority and a reminder of what has been lost. Other policies follow a similar pattern of mixture, assertion wrapped in adaptation. The Qing court quickly realizes that ruling a vast agrarian literate society requires more than military garrisons. They keep much of the Ming administrative framework, the 6 ministries, the examination system, the provincial structure. They allow Confucian classics to remain at the heart of official ideology, and in time, they themselves will sponsor large-scale scholarly projects, encyclopedias, and commentaries that present them as guardians of the very tradition they displaced. At the same time, they build protections for their own ruling group into the system. The banner garrisons in key cities are maintained as separate military colonies, often with land and stipends insulated from local pressures. High offices are divided between Manchu and Han officials, with careful quotas, ensuring that the core levers of power remain in the hands of those loyal to the dynasty's inner circle. Certain legal privileges apply to bannermen that do not apply to commoners. For local elites, navigating this new order means learning the contours of a hierarchy that is both familiar and altered. The bureaucratic forms look much like the Ming. The seal impressions, the memorials, the ritual language, these feel continuous. But behind the desk the accent may be Manchu. Behind the provincial governor there may be a banner commander whose opinion matters more than any Confucian quotation. Conquest in this sense stretches far beyond the battlefield. It moves into hairstyle mandates, salary tables, joint commissions of Manchu and Han censors, negotiations over grain shipments, quiet arguments in Yamen courtyards about how strictly to enforce a new edict. It lives in the daily compromises that allow people to survive under a new flag, what to accept, what to resist, what to pretend to honour while quietly ignoring. For the Qing, these years are a balancing act. Push too hard, and the conquered population might erupt again, as it has so many times before in Chinese history. Concede too much, and the Manchu core might feel its identity dissolving into the sea of its subjects. The transition from conquerors on horseback to emperors on a dragon throne requires both steel and silk, both visible power and carefully crafted stories. In proclamations, the court speaks of restoring order, of punishing bandits and comforting the people. In private councils, Dorgon and his advisors argue over deployments, over which Ming institutions to keep, over how far to lean on Wu Sangui and other Chinese generals, whose loyalty is useful but never entirely trusted. Gradually, through this mixture of coercion, co-option and adaptation, the shape of a dynasty begins to solidify. The Qing are no longer simply an army that passed the Great Wall with a desperate Ming general. They are starting to look like what they claim to be from the moment they step through the gate at Shanhai Pass. The new bearer of the mandate seated in Beijing, expecting petitions from the provinces, sending out their own edicts on paper stamped with fresh imperial seals. But south of the Yellow River, in hills and river valleys beyond the easy reach of the northern garrisons, not everyone accepts this new reality. There are still princes to rally around, still banners with the old dynasty's colours, still men who believe that the story isn't over just because a child sits on the throne in the Forbidden City. The conquest has claimed the capital. Turning that into an uncontested empire will be another struggle entirely. If you travel south in your mind, away from the dust of Beijing and the new banners over its gates, the story of the dynasty's fall does not end with a noose and a Manchu coronation. It splinters. In Nanjing, in Fuzhou, in Guangzhou, new courts appear like reflections in a broken mirror. Each one claims to be the rightful continuation of the Ming. Each one insists that the mandate has only retreated to regroup, not passed forever to foreign hands. Historians usually call these the Southern Ming. The names and reign titles can blur together if you try to memorize them as a list. Hongguang, Longwu, Shaowu, Yongli. A procession of emperors who rule for years in the calendar and sometimes only months in reality. But beneath the clutter of names is a simple pattern. When Beijing falls, the Ming imperial clan does not vanish. Princes of the blood are scattered through the provinces, holding nominal posts, inspecting granaries, living under the old system's protective haze. Suddenly, with the emperor dead and the capital lost, any surviving prince becomes a possible focal point for loyalty. In Nanjing, officials and military men gather around one such figure, the Prince of Fu, elevated as the Hongguang emperor. They swear oaths, draft proclamations, resurrect the old forms of court ritual. The red lacquer and silk look familiar. The language in memorials sounds like the Ming always has, about rectifying the realm, about punishing traitors, about comforting the people. On paper, it is a restoration. In practice, It feels more like a group of shipwreck survivors climbing onto a half-submerged raft. Resources are thin. The treasury has been drained by years of rebellion and banditry. Grain shipments from the north have been disrupted. Local governors are already negotiating with Qing commanders, hedging their bets. Generals raise troops more loyal to themselves than to any distant throne. And within the Nanjing court itself, unity is a hope rather than a reality. Some officials want to focus on defending the lower Yangtze region, fortifying the river lines, buying time. Others argue for a mobile war, retreating deeper into the south if necessary, conserving strength. Military commanders angle for favour, denouncing each other as unreliable. Accusations of collaboration and treachery start to fly long before the enemy arrives at the walls. This is one of the Southern Ming's deepest problems. The shared hatred of the Qing and nostalgia for the Ming banner are not enough to erase rivalries that have been building for years. Regional loyalties, family networks, personal grudges, all of these shape decisions in smoky council rooms and cramped palaces. When Nanjing falls to Qing forces in 1645, the Southern Ming does not end. It simply moves. Another prince is lifted up in Fuzhou, the Longwu Emperor. New reign title, new seals carved, new era proclaimed. Loyalist officials who escape the north or the lower Yangtze drift here, bringing with them their books, their anxieties, their ambitions. But the pattern repeats. The court is fractious. Coordination with distant loyalist forces is weak. Naval commanders along the coast pursue their own strategies, sometimes cooperating, sometimes acting like independent warlords, with a convenient imperial figurehead. All the while, the Qing are not standing still. Their armies push steadily southward, often under the command of men like Wu Sangui and other former Ming generals, who have thrown in their lot with the new regime. They move along river valleys, seize strategic cities, and demand submission from local elites. The conquest is not a clean, orderly process. In many places it is a series of shocks. A county that has seen little direct fighting for years suddenly finds a banner army at its gates. Negotiations might begin with polite language and promises of protection. They might end with a massacre if resistance is offered or suspected. Sources from the period describe towns burned, civilians killed alongside soldiers, entire regions disrupted as armies move through, stripping fields for supplies. Some of these accounts are coloured by loyalist bitterness and later memory, but even if you read them cautiously, a picture emerges of conquest as a grinding, often brutal process rather than a swift changing of flags. Hair orders, taxes, requisitions, demands for hostages, these accompany the marches. In some areas, surrender is followed by relative calm. In others, resistance flares again after a seemingly settled submission, prompting harsher crackdowns. The boundary between bandit, loyalist, and rebel blurs on the ground, where any armed group claiming a cause might be indistinguishable to frightened villagers. Back among the Southern Ming, the fragmentation deepens. While one emperor holds court in one city, another prince might be proclaimed in another. For a brief confusing moment, there are even rival Ming emperors, both claiming legitimacy in the south, each accusing the other of endangering the dynasty's survival through arrogance. Officials and generals face impossible choices. Do you commit to one claimant and alienate the followers of another? Do you try to mediate between courts, knowing that hesitation can look like disloyalty? Do you abandon an emperor you think is doomed in order to continue resistance elsewhere? Every move carries the risk of being branded a traitor by someone. Meanwhile, resources grow scarcer. Silver flows erratically as trade is disrupted. The coastal economy is hammered by blockades and shifting control of ports. Armies go unpaid. Desertion grows. Local populations, already battered by famine and prior unrest, can no longer sustain repeated levies of grain and labour. In the southwest, the resistance lasts the longest. Here, in the rugged terrain of Guangxi, Guizhou, and Yunnan, a final southern Ming court coalesces around the Yongle Emperor. He is carried from place to place as Qing pressure increases, his court thinning, his realm shrinking. Yet around him, there are still men willing to fight. One of the most famous is Zheng Chenggong, known in the West as Koxinga. Half Chinese, half Japanese, raised amid maritime trade and piracy, he turns his naval strength into a weapon of loyalism. He refuses to cut his hair in the Manchu style, keeps the Ming flag flying over his ships, and carves out strongholds along the southeastern coast. For him and his followers, the sea becomes both refuge and battlefield. Zheng's forces raid Qing-held ports, support inland resistance, and for years maintain an alternative vision of what China might be under a resurrected Ming. Eventually he will seize Taiwan from the Dutch and turn it into a loyalist base, a Ming world in exile looking warily at the continent under Qing control. On land, other figures emerge in local memory. Scholar officials who refuse office under the Qing and starve themselves rather than submit. Village leaders who organize militias for one last stand. Women who become symbols of chastity and loyalty, praised in later stories for dying rather than marrying under the new dynasty. Some of these stories are embellished over time, their details smoothed into legend, but they speak to a broader undercurrent. Loyalty to the fallen house does not vanish when the southern Ming courts are finally extinguished. When the Yongle Emperor is eventually captured and executed in the far southwest, the last ember of that formal imperial resistance is snuffed out. The Qing can now claim, with more justification than before, that there is no rival throne within the old Ming borders. Yet on a quieter level, resistance persists. In lineage halls and private academies, scholars compose elegiac poems that mourn the Ming in oblique language. They study under the Qing examination system while secretly venerating loyalist martyrs. Genealogies preserve stories of ancestors who refused the shave, who died with the dynasty. Local operas and ballads keep the memory of battles alive, sometimes thinly disguised, sometimes explicit. A village festival might, on the surface, celebrate a local deity, but also carry hints of past uprisings woven into its performances. Anti-Qing sentiment surfaces again and again over the following centuries, sometimes exploding into open rebellions that invoke the Ming as a symbol. White Lotus uprisings, secret societies, groups that whisper about driving out the barbarians and restoring the Ming. These draw on the emotional reservoir created in the 1640s and 1650s. From the vantage point of a modern timeline, we often compress the story. Beijing falls in 1644. The Qing take over China. A neat succession of dynasties marching across the page. But if you slow the story down to human time, you see how untidy it really is. Decisions made in panic in Nanjing, debates by candlelight in Fuzhou, long marches through rain-soaked hills in the southwest, naval skirmishes off Fujian, families in small towns arguing over whether to submit to the new order or gamble on yet another loyalist army passing through. The Qing victory is real. They will sit in Beijing for generations. But it is not the inevitable, instantaneous triumph that a starting date in a textbook might suggest. It is a victory dragged out over decades, under constant pressure, shadowed by the memory of a dynasty that many people are not yet ready to let go, and that long contested birth will shape how the Qing understand themselves and how later generations understand what it means when we say that a dynasty lasted 276 years. 276 years. On the page, it looks like a single stretch of ink between two dates. 1644 to 1912, a line in a chart, a tidy answer for a quiz. But if you slow it down and let it expand, that line becomes almost unimaginably thick. It's the lifetime of how many people? Imagine a woman born in the chaos of the 1640s. She grows up hearing stories about shaved foreheads and queues, about cities burned in the south, about an emperor who hanged himself on a lonely hill in Beijing. To her, the Ming is not history, it's her parents' grief. The reason her grandfather refuses to use the new reign title when he dates letters. She lives, let's say, 70 years. Long enough to see the dust of conquest settle into something that looks like normal life. Long enough to see banner garrisons become familiar fixtures on the edge of town. Long enough to hear that the empire's borders are pushing west and north, that there are new maps with names she's never heard. When she dies, another child is born that same year. For this child, the Qing is not a new regime, it's just the state. The emperor in Beijing is as remote and unquestioned as the stars. His edicts are the framework of the world, not an interruption of it. That child grows up, has children, tells them stories about the strange unrest that breaks out now and then. Rebels with red turbans, sects talking about the end of days. He lives through his own 70 years of droughts and floods, of exam cycles and tax demands, of local disputes and rumours about far frontiers. By the time he dies, the dynasty is still young enough that no one calls it old, but old enough that no living person remembers a world without it. Repeat this passing of generations 3-4 times and you're near the other end of that line. The world of railroads and telegraphs, foreign gunboats on rivers, treaties signed under pressure, new ideas about citizens and nations creeping in through treaty ports. From the viewpoint of that last generation, Wu Sangui is as distant as myth. His name belongs to plays and cautionary tales, not to living memory. And yet, if you stack those lives carefully, one hand reaching forward, another hand reaching back, the chain between a rainy morning at Shanhai Pass and the abdication edict in 1912 is surprisingly short. Maybe 4, maybe 5 lifetimes. This is one way to think about those 276 years, not as a number, but as overlapping circles of memory and forgetting. Another way is to look at the map. When Wu opened the gate, the territory that called itself China was mostly the old Ming heartland, with contested claims beyond. Over the course of Qing rule, that space stretches. Under Kangxi, Yongzheng, Qianlong, the long 18th century of High Qing, the empire pushes hard to the north and west. The Manchu rulers, who began as outsiders beyond the Great Wall, eventually rule over lands that previous Ming emperors only touched in theory. Inner and outer Mongolia come under firmer control, the Qing playing steppe alliances and rivalries with skill inherited from both their Jurchen past and their experience dealing with Chinese officials. Tibet is drawn into an imperial orbit through patronage of lamas and military interventions, its status complex layered with religious and political meanings. Xinjiang, after long hard campaigns against the Zungas and other powers, is turned from a frontier of shifting influence into something more like an integrated province, though on terms that look very different from the governance of a Jiangnan county. By the late 18th century, if you unfolded a Qing atlas, the shape you'd see would look startlingly familiar to a modern eye. A rough outline of what people in the 21st century call China, including regions that today are hotly debated or tightly controlled. That territorial reach did not mean uniformity. The Qing court understood that ruling a multi-ethnic, multilingual empire required a toolkit, not a single instrument. In some places they governed through banner garrisons and direct appointments. In others, they left hereditary chieftains in place, gradually bringing them to heel. They issued edicts in Manchu and Chinese, sometimes Mongolian and Tibetan. They used Confucian ritual language for Han literati, Buddhist and shamanic forms for steppe and plateau elites. In Beijing, the Qing emperors presented themselves as heirs to the Son of Heaven, performing sacrifices at the Temple of Heaven, upholding the civil service examinations, sponsoring commentaries on the classics. At the same time, they maintained Manchu hunting preserves, practiced their own martial and ritual traditions, and cultivated images of themselves as Khans to the Mongols, Chakravartin kings to Tibetan Buddhists. The dynasty, in other words, was not simply foreign versus Chinese. It was a constantly shifting blend. Manchu banners formed the core of imperial military and social organization. Mongol princes and nobles married into the ruling house and received titles and lands. Han Chinese officials staffed the bureaucracy down to the county level, drafting memorials and managing grain, tax and justice systems that had evolved over centuries. Jesuits and other Europeans appeared at court as technical specialists, drawing maps, casting cannons, building clocks. The Qing state was a braided rope of different traditions, some older than the Ming, some distinctly new. Meanwhile, under that braided authority, a demographic transformation unfolded. When the Qing came to power, China's population was probably around 150 million, give or take. Estimates vary, and early Qing numbers are fuzzy. By the late 18th century, the figure often cited, based on contemporaneous counts and later reconstructions, is in the range of 300 million or more. Twice as many people living under the same dynasty. Fields that had lain fallow during the late Ming crises are reclaimed. New rice varieties spread. Maize, sweet potatoes, peanuts, and other crops introduced over the previous century sink deeper roots into local agriculture, especially in marginal lands. Hillsides are terraced, riverbanks diked, irrigation extended. Villages multiply, then fuse into market towns. Old river ports expand. The Grand Canal, whenever it is functioning well, becomes the heavy, slow artery that moves grain north and silver south. In some regions, proto-industrial production, textiles, ceramics, handicrafts, thrives within this agrarian framework, tying interior counties to coastal trade networks reaching Japan, Southeast Asia, even Europe. All of this is happening under the same dynasty name, the same banner system, modified but recognizable. The same examination format with its 8-legged essays and canonical references, binding the ambitions of scholars in Anhui and Guangdong into one imperial web. The same palaces in Beijing, repainted and repaired across reigns, their walls hearing Manchu, Chinese, Mongolian, and sometimes Latin. When you say the Qing lasted 276 years, what you're really saying is that one political framework managed, with adjustments and crises, to stay intact while the world inside it changed almost beyond recognition. From horse messengers to telegraph lines, from frontier skirmishes with steppe peoples to treaty ports forced open by steam-powered gunboats, from edicts written with brushes on silk to newspapers printed in Shanghai, criticizing or defending the throne. In that long arc, Wu Sangui's decision at Shanhai Pass is not the sole cause of anything. The Qing did not spring fully formed from one opened gate. Their rise was the culmination of decades of Manchu state building, of alliances and reforms, of internal Ming decay and external pressure. If Wu had chosen differently, if he had tried to resist both Li Zicheng and the Manchus, the next few years might have looked very different. Perhaps a stalemate along the Great Wall, perhaps a surviving Ming enclave in the northeast, perhaps an even more fragmented period of warlordism before someone else pulled the pieces together. History rarely depends on a single moment the way a legend does, and yet his choice mattered. By letting Dorgon's armies through at precisely that juncture, when the Ming capital had just fallen, when Li's regime was fragile, when northern defences could have become a prolonged barrier, Wu didn't invent the Qing. But he did help clear their path to Beijing, and with it to the symbolic centre of imperial legitimacy. From there, the Manchu court could claim, with increasing confidence over time, that they were not invaders camping outside civilization, but the bearers of the mandate at its heart. The consequences of that shift radiated outward. They shaped which scripts your hypothetical 18th-century scholar would memorize, which emperor's reign title he would inscribe at the top of his examination paper. They determined which banners garrisoned the city where his grandchildren were born, what haircut they wore by law, which borders they thought of as ours. By the time the Qing finally ended in 1912, the dynasty had presided over a world that would have been almost unrecognizable to those who marched under Wu Sangui's command. Railways cut across provinces where his cavalry once rode. Western-style schools trained students to think in terms of citizen and nation, rather than subject and dynasty. Newspapers debated whether the throne itself should continue to exist. And yet, if you trace the line back, through reforms and rebellions, through high Qing splendour and 19th-century humiliation, you still arrive at that day in 1644, at a pass in the mountains, in the dust and confusion, with a general court between two collapsing orders. 276 years is a long time for any decision to echo, long enough that the echo changes as it travels. But it's still, in some sense, the same sound. A gate opening, a path chosen, an empire taking shape around the consequences. Wu Sangui does not vanish when the gate swings open. The story often stops there, as if he dissolves into the dust behind Dorgon's horse. Traitor, Han Jian, the man who let the barbarians in. Curtain down, but Wu keeps walking. Once Li Zicheng is pushed out of Beijing and the Shunji emperor is installed, the new rulers have a problem. They need the empire, but they don't yet have the reach to hold it. Their banners are fierce cavalry, their command structure tight, but their numbers are small compared to the vastness they now claim. So they do what conquerors often do in the first uncertain years. They buy time with titles. For Wu Sangui, that bargain looks generous. He is made Qin Prince, Pingxi Wang, Prince who pacifies the West. His troops, once Ming, then technically Qing, are allowed to remain largely under his own command. He's given a huge fief and military authority over a swath of the southwest. Parts of today's Yunnan and Guizhou with reach into Sichuan. On paper, he serves the Qing. In practice, he is almost a state within the state. The Ming remnants fleeing south give him plenty of work to do. In the immediate aftermath of 1644, the Ming court does not simply vanish. Princes and officials regroup in Nanjing, Fuzhou, Guangzhou, elsewhere, raising banners, minting reign titles, trying to keep the mandate alive. The Qing turn to generals like Wu, men who know the terrain and the networks, to chase them down. He fights the southern Ming, pushes through the river valley, storms towns in the south. The man who once was supposed to defend the dynasty now becomes one of the sharpest blades cutting off its remaining branchlets. Reward follows. His fief becomes more entrenched. His forces settle in Yunnan. Local officials, Han and non-Han, find that if they want something done, they often go through Wu's lieutenants, not through distant Beijing. Taxes, justice, troop levies, many of these in practice depend on his endorsement. He mans the frontier against not just rebels but also local chieftains, indigenous groups, and whatever foreign shadows might appear along the southwestern borders. From the court's point of view, it's convenient. The throne can focus on the north and centre, while these feudatory princes manage the rough edges. Wu is not the only one. Two other great Han generals, Shang Kexi and Geng Jingzhong, receive similar semi-hereditary fiefs in the south and southeast. Together they will later be called the Three Feudatories. For the moment, though, that label does not yet exist. What exists is a compromise. The Qing need them. They fear them. They hope that, over time, the banner system and the centralized bureaucracy will grow strong enough that these independent power bases can be trimmed back. Wu, in his southwest seat, understands this. The region he rules is not an easy, flat, obedient landscape. Yunnan in the 17th century is a patchwork of Han migrants, older non-Han communities, and upland zones that have long histories of semi-autonomy. Trade routes thread through mountains toward Burma, Southeast Asia, and Tibet. Armies do badly here if they don't respect local alliances and logistics. Wu builds his power by inserting himself into that web. He maintains Ming-era ties with local elites, cultivates relationships with hereditary chieftains, negotiates with merchant groups. To many people in the region, loyalty is not a simple question of Ming versus Qing. It's who can protect caravans, who can mediate disputes, who can keep bandits at bay. In that sense, Wu is not just a traitor general, he is also a regional strongman playing the long game of survival in a fragmented political field. Of course, from the centre, this looks more and more like a problem. By the time the Shunji Emperor dies and the Kangxi Emperor comes of age, decades have passed since that day at Shanhai Pass. The Qing have stabilized the north, crushed major rebellions, expanded their administrative reach. Banner garrisons stand in cities that once seemed remote. The throne can now ask a question that would have been unthinkable in the 1640s. Do we still need these feudatory princes? The answer from young Kangxi's reform-minded advisers is no, or at least not in their current semi-autonomous form. The court begins to signal that the great southern and southwestern fiefs will be reduced or withdrawn, the troops folded into the regular Qing structure, the tax streams redirected toward Beijing. It is, from a state-building perspective, a rational move. You cannot have multiple hereditary warlords indefinitely and still claim to be an absolute empire. To Wu Sangui, the man who once opened a gate and watched an old world fall, this sounds familiar. Again, a centre he has helped empower now contemplates using that power against him. Again, the bargain that he will serve and in return be protected and honoured shows its cracks. He's aging now. The early heat of his revenge against Li Zicheng has cooled, turned into something more solid. Concern for his family line, his own posthumous name, the security of the world he has carved out in Yunnan. He is married into local elites, arranged successors, invested in temples and estates. If the Qing strip his fief, what will become of all that? So, when the court moves to recall or reduce the feudatories, Wu does not simply bow. In 1673 he and other feudatory lords petition to retire, a move that forces the throne's hand, accept their resignation and lose the buffer of their armies, or refuse and risk open defiance. Kangxi, determined to centralize, accepts. The message is clear: your time as near kings is over. Wu responds not with quiet retreat but with rebellion. This is the revolt of the three feudatories. It sweeps across much of the south and southwest. Wu, with his southwestern armies, becomes its most powerful figure. He claims at various points to be restoring Chinese rule, to be opposing the barbarian Manchu court. He revives the rhetoric of dynastic legitimacy, plays on lingering Ming loyalist sentiment, presents himself as something more than a disgruntled provincial commander. Whether he believes all of this in any deep sense, or whether it is mainly a political banner to rally troops and elites, is difficult to say with certainty. Historians see both personal calculation and genuine ideological language threaded together. In any case, Wu, who once helped destroy the southern Ming, now positions himself, decades later, as a potential founder of a new order, or at least as a defender of Han autonomy against Manchu centralization. The irony is thick. The revolt drags on for years. It is brutal, grinding, expensive. Cities change hands multiple times. Local populations suffer, as they almost always do in long civil wars. The Qing, at first shaken, slowly marshal their advantages. Banner forces, newly loyal Han commanders, control over key river routes. They play the feudatories against each other, peel away support. Wu Sangui does not live to see the end. He dies in 1678, reportedly after proclaiming himself emperor of a short-lived regime, the Zhou. His heirs try to carry on, but the revolt loses coherence. By 1681 the Qing have crushed it. The fiefs of the three feudatories are abolished. The dream of semi-independent regional kingdoms under Qing suzerainty is over. Wu's legacy, already complicated, becomes even harder to pin down. Later generations look back and see almost whatever they need to see. For Qing loyalist writers, he is the archetype of treachery, the man who betrayed Ming to Qing and then Qing to his own ambition. Opening the gate is only the first sin. Rebelling against the benefactor that raised him to princely rank becomes the second. For some late Ming loyalist literati, there is no redemption. His momentary anti-Qing stance in the revolt of the three feudatories does not wash away the earlier betrayal. Once a traitor, always a traitor. In the 20th century, with new ideas of nation and race, he is often cast in sharper colours. Schoolbooks in Republican and later eras sometimes present him as the classic Hanjian, the Han collaborator who helped foreign Manchus conquer China. Plays and novels depict him as greedy, lustful, weak-willed, easily swayed by personal grievances. His rumoured infatuation with Chen Yuanyuan, the courtesan caught up in the fall of Beijing, becomes a symbol of private desire overwhelming public duty. At other times, some writers emphasise his pragmatism. In a world collapsing around him, he chose the side that could keep the realm from fragmenting further, they argue, or at least the side that looked strongest in that moment. In the revolt of the three feudatories, they see not only ambition but also resistance to over-centralization, to the erasure of regional autonomy. To them, he is less monster than mirror, a man trying to navigate between larger forces, switching banners when survival and advantage demand it. Under communist rule, with its own narratives about class and central authority, Wu tends to stay firmly in the villainous camp. His personal revenge, his regional warlordism, his shifting loyalties, all stand as cautionary examples of feudal selfishness versus the supposed clarity of collective struggle. Through all these reinterpretations, one thread remains. Wu Sangui is almost never allowed to be small. He is always the lever, the hinge, the symbol, the man who opened the gate, the man who almost tore the new dynasty apart, the embodiment of betrayal, or of tragic entanglement, or of cold realism, depending on who is telling the story and when. You can return one last time to that first motive we attach to him, revenge. The betrayal by Li Zicheng, the captured family, the personal humiliation. It seems like a spark that sets everything in motion. But after that spark, does Wu really steer the fire? Or does he, like so many others, find that once the flames catch, they race along structures much larger than any one person? Military institutions, regional economies, dynastic cycles, ethnic politics. When he opens the gate, he may think he's avenging an insult, protecting his clan, choosing the lesser evil. Years later, as Prince of the West, as rebel, as would-be emperor, he moves through a world increasingly shaped by that initial choice, by the Qing state that grows in its wake. At a certain point, it becomes hard to say whether he is still wielding history, or whether history is wielding him. His story, seen from the soft distance of your pillow, starts to look less like a simple moral tale and more like a pattern. A man trying to carve out justice and safety in a collapsing order, reaching for control through one dramatic act, only to be carried forward by currents he cannot see the end of. The gate he opened was not just in a wall of stone, it was in the fabric of possibility itself. Once it swung wide, a new path unfurled, one that would outlive him by centuries, that would redefine borders, languages, loyalties, and the way later generations would whisper his name in the dark. Whether Wu Sangui walked that path or was dragged along it is a question the past can't fully answer. It leaves the echo of his footsteps and the creak of that opening gate for you to listen to and decide. If you follow that path forward, past Wu Sangui, past Dorgon, past the dust of the three feudatories, you start to see the full length of the echo. It begins, on the surface, as a crisis of one dynasty, a court weakened by corrupt favourites and frozen factions, silver shortages, tax arrears, peasants squeezed by landlords who are themselves squeezed by a desperate state, floods and droughts in the north, locusts and famine in the centre, pirate raids and smuggling on the coasts, bandits turning into rebels, rebels turning into would-be kings. All of that is already in motion long before Wu stands under the walls at Shanhai Pass. You could say the Ming were cracking from within, grain transport systems faltering, garrisons unpaid, border generals like Wu learning to rely more on local loyalties than distant edicts. The great machine of empire, tax registers, courier routes, memorials stamped with vermilion ink, still moving, but grinding, throwing off sparks. If no one had opened that gate, something would still have broken. Perhaps Li Zicheng's regime might have lingered, perhaps fractured. Perhaps some other northern power would have seeped through the Great Wall in a different season. Perhaps regional strongmen would have carved the country into separate realms. Those are the structural possibilities, the cracks in the dam, the weight of accumulated snow on the roof. But structures on their own don't choose. They create pressures, narrow the field of options, make some paths easier to walk and others almost unthinkable. Then, at certain points, a human being stands in a doorway and decides which of those paths will become real. Shanhai Pass in the spring of 1644 is one of those doorways. On one side, a rebel court in Beijing, uncertain and internally divided, ruling in the name of the people but needing grain and silver from men like Wu. On another, a Manchu confederation hardened by years of war, disciplined, well-mounted, waiting outside the walls with their own vision of rule. In between, a frontier commander with his family held hostage, his honour stung, his soldiers exhausted, his messages to the capital gone unanswered. The collapse of the Ming did not depend on him alone, but the birth of the Qing Empire as it actually unfolded, the banners riding through the passes, the new capital in Beijing, the specific 276-year arc that would follow, ran through the hinge of his choice. When he ordered the gates opened, all the long-gathering strains aligned for a moment with one man's anguish and calculation. Structural collapse met personal decision. An empire's fatigue met a private revenge. And history, like water, took the gap that appeared. From that opening flowed a chain of consequences. The consolidation of Manchu rule, the reweaving of administration, the expansion into Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang. The shaping of borders that still outline maps today. Policies that would influence language, dress, social categories, the way people thought about Han and Manchu, about centre and frontier. Generations were born, lived and died under banners that only crossed the wall because a gate once swung on its hinges instead of holding fast. You can imagine it now, if you like, as you drift towards sleep. A stone fortress on a windy neck of land between mountains and sea. Torches guttering in the pre-dawn dark. Men on the walls, tired, confused, listening for hoofbeats. A general standing before a massive wooden gate, hearing, in the distance, the rumble of two different futures approaching from opposite sides. Somewhere, a command is given. Chains clatter. Iron squeals against iron. The great doors begin to move, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum until there is space enough for a horse, a file of riders, an army, a new dynasty to pass. That sound, that grinding creak of wood and metal and decision, is still there, if you listen for it. In every later edict from a Qing emperor, in every village tax dispute settled under a new regime, in every border marked on a schoolroom globe that traces its line back through those centuries. A crisis of state finance, a pattern of rebellion, a climb of a steppe power learning the language of empire, a single command at a mountain pass. They all fold into one another until you cannot easily say where impersonal forces end and one person's choice begins. As you rest here, at the quiet edge of the story, you can let that uncertainty be gentle rather than unsettling. The past is not a strict ledger of blame, but a tapestry woven from countless threads, some thick as dynasties, some fine as the thoughts that flicker through one person's mind before they speak. The gate at Shanhai Pass opened once. In a sense, it is always opening, in memory and in consequence, letting the 17th century spill forward into the centuries after, and into the world that surrounds you now. If you've stayed with this story all the way here, thank you for listening. If you'd like more journeys like this, slow, winding paths through the past you can fall asleep to, feel free to tap like or subscribe so you can find your way back next time. And before you drift off completely, if you have a moment, leave a comment and tell us where you're listening from. A city, a village, a dorm room, a night shift break room. All of those distant places, all of you listening in the dark become part of the echo too.